Will everybody please kindly rise for the Pledge of Allegiance by Darrell Reason, the Western Regional Vice President, will lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Kindly remain standing for the invocation by the Reverend Petty Peace from Las Vegas.
Shall we bow our heads in prayer? Our Heavenly Father, thankful for your love and for your grace towards us, thankful for the opportunity to stand before these people. Father, I pray that you just lead and guide and direct them in the decisions that they make. And as they make decisions to control people's lives and destinies, Father, may they realize that you control their life and their destiny. May they look to thee, and may they trust thee as their own personal Savior. May they just be led and guided by your Spirit. Father, we pray now that you just bless and guide and direct, for we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.
I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the brothers and sister PATCO members, all air traffic controllers, and our honored guests. This is our 11th annual convention, and at this time, it is with great pride that I introduce our national president, John F. Layden. Thank you. Thank you. Distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, Senator Cannon of Nevada yesterday addressed the Executive Board and afterwards informally thanked us for bringing this convention to Nevada with all of the generous and free-spending air traffic controllers that are attendant to this convention. He's heard about the freewheeling lifestyles which we live. He also knows that the odds at the blackjack table favor the House, a great portion of which goes to the state of Nevada. This state is embarking on a remodeling program to air condition all of their primary and secondary schools. And he fully expects that by the close of this convention, the air traffic controller workforce will make a significant contribution to the funding of that program. In spite of the heavy press of business facing this body for the next 3 days, since this is the 10th anniversary of PATCO, our organization, I feel it would be proper to step back for a moment and view PATCO's evolution in hopes that in tracing our history, we gain a clearer picture for the future. When the first gathering of what was to become the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization was held on January 11th of 1968, the air traffic control system of this nation was in a shambles. There were only approximately 9,000 controllers to handle an aviation system that had been growing in quantum leaps. Compulsory overtime was routine, and because of inadequate pay laws, controllers actually received less money for working overtime than they did for working straight time. Equipment in the system, for the most part, was World War II vintage surplus equipment that was so outdated and antiquated that other countries would not utilize it or even accept it. There had been a rigid hiring freeze imposed on the air traffic control system, and for the previous 6 years, the FAA Training Academy in Oklahoma City had been closed. The low morale of the air traffic controller workforce at the time defied description. We could stand no more. Banding together, we formed an organization that would attempt to improve both the safety of the air traffic control system and better the working conditions of those who manned it. That organization was PATCO. Let us briefly examine now how that organization has performed. Today, there are over 17,000 air traffic controllers safely operating a system utilizing increasingly modern equipment. The top grade achievable for controllers in our profession has been elevated 2 grades in this relatively short period. The controller's career has been increasingly made more secure by the passage of early retirement and second career, which now permits controllers who face medical disqualification because of the pressure of our profession the opportunity to face retirement with dignity. Controllers are now protected from the traditional abuses of FAA management by the most progressive labor contract in the federal sector. Controllers facing the traumatic experience of involvement in an aviation accident now have the comfort and assurance of a highly trained and skilled representative to protect their rights and interests during the inevitable hearings that ensue. Early this morning, moments after arriving here, one of our PATCO NTSB representatives was dispatched to Pensacola, Florida, to protect the rights of other members should the need arise during the National 727 crash which occurred in Pensacola, Florida. The image of the air traffic controller profession has been elevated, and we are now accepted as true professionals. Both the aviation industry and the public at large recognize the dedicated men and women who make up the air traffic control system and recognize us as responsible professionals and an integral part of a most vital industry. But perhaps most of all, we now view ourselves as professionals who are proud to be and proud to remain air traffic controllers. These gains have not come easily. At each and every turn and juncture, the mettle of this organization and the controllers it represents has been tested. We have successfully answered these challenges. In facing the future, we must guard against complacency. We have been relatively successful, but much remains to be accomplished. It now appears that in the very near future, this organization will again face a major challenge. The Operations Committee of the Air Transport Association will meet in Washington tomorrow, May 10th, to decide their participation in the overseas FAM portion of the SF-160 program, which is in our contract. I'm an eternal optimist, and I expect their decision to be favorable. However, if it is not, PATCO will not walk away from that challenge. You will decide what we must do in order to have people honor our recently ratified and signed contract. Our final position, and we will have further discussion on this issue during the course of this convention. To the business at hand, we face a full agenda for the next 3 days. Opinions on the issues at this convention, as on many issues that have faced us in the past, are strictly and sharply divided. I fully expect the debate to be open and candid because of the nature of this organization, which runs a full gamut of philosophical and political extremes. But traditionally, and for the future survival of this organization, we always close ranks after the spirited debate. One of the most important challenges facing you at this convention is the election of the leaders who will direct your organization for the next 3 years. Once the voting is concluded, we again must set aside our philosophical and regional differences, and in the true spirit of brotherhood and unity, we must work together to overcome whatever obstacles the future holds. Now let us get on with the important and vital work of this convention. Thank you. I'd like to officially open now the 11th Annual Convention of PATCO. Those were the winners at the tables. Not too many of them. We have with us this morning Congressman Lloyd Meads of Washington. He served with distinction in the House of Representatives since 1964 and as a key member of the House Rules Committee, through which most legislation must pass before going on to the floor of Congress. As a member of Congress since the birth of PATCO, he's had an opportunity firsthand to view our early struggles and our difficult growth. He's been a loyal and trusted friend in times of need, and we're proud and greatly honored to have Congressman Meads as our keynote speaker as we start our second decade. Let's give a welcome to Congressman Lloyd Meads.
Thank you very much, John Layden. Bob Poli, Mike Rock, Darrell Reason, the Vice President from the region from which I also hail. Hello out there, Seattle. All other head table guests, members of PATCO, families of members and guests. Let me at the outset indicate to you how pleased I am to be here with you, particularly in Las Vegas. I can't understand why the air traffic controllers would decide to have a convention in Las Vegas. They don't gamble at all. You can, if you don't believe me, just ask some of these dealers and people at the tables. You're driving them crazy with your computer-like minds, betting everything, and running 3 or 4 hands of blackjack at one time and all these things. I think they're going to, maybe the senator's happy, but the people at the table, they got problems. I'm also very proud to be with you during your 10th anniversary, celebration of your 10th anniversary. And for that occasion, I prepared a written speech. Now I don't often do that, but I have some specific things I want to say, and I don't want to be misunderstood. But my reluctance about written speeches occurred shortly after I became a member of the Congress. One of my colleagues, who was not known as a great public speaker, cast about to determine how he could improve his speaking ability, and finally hired a bright young journalism graduate from the University of Washington School of Journalism, and the young fellow began to write my colleague's speeches, and he improved, and my colleague became known as a good speaker in our own state, and later in the Western area, and finally across the nation. And after about 3 years, the speechwriter went up to my colleague and said, "Look, boss, I've been with you now for 3 years. I think I've done a reasonably commendable job of writing your speeches, and I haven't had a raise since I've been with you. I'd like a raise." My colleague looked at him and said, "Look, Joe, you were overpaid when I hired you, and you really haven't caught up yet. No, you can't have a raise." Well, Joe didn't say anything, but he kind of went back to his cubicle, and not long after that, my colleague was to deliver a very, very important address to 3,000 of his own constituents, and believe me, they don't get more important than that. So he said to Joe, he says, "Prepare this speech for me, will you?" And Joe said, "Yes, boss," and he went off, and about 3 days later, my colleague went to get on the plane. Joe handed him the speech as he went out the door. He sat down on the plane, and as would often happen, he had a martini or two on the way and got to talking with somebody sitting next to him. Didn't get a chance to look at the speech. Arrived in Seattle, got on a busy schedule out there, didn't get a chance to look at the speech. So the fact is that he had not seen that written speech until he set it on the podium before him, as I've done with this one. And the speech began like this. It said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to lay before you today a 10-point program to cure all of the ills of this country, not only the domestic but the foreign ills." Now let me tick those off quickly. First, he said, we're going to see that every young person in this country gets 14 years of free public education, not just 12. Secondly, we're going to increase Social Security benefits by 50%. Of course, all the people in there who were on Social Security cheered and clapped. He said, next we're going to see that nobody in this nation is without a job. Everyone else cheered and clapped. He ticked off 9 things, of course, that were just a veritable agenda for what needed to be done in this nation. And finally he said, and number 10, we're going to do every one of those, and we're going to cut taxes by 10%. Wow, the place just broke up. And he could see that he had these people pretty much in the palm of his hand at that point, and he went off his speech a little, and he said, now you people know that I've never been one to deal in generalities. I'm going to tell you exactly how we're going to do every one of these things. He turned the page in his speech, and there in his speechwriter's handwriting was scrawled the following words: okay, cheapskate, now you're on your own. But there are no surprises in this speech for me because I wrote it myself. And incidentally, I thank you for the occasion to do so, because I learned some things about you that I didn't know before. Such occasions as 10th anniversaries are traditionally a time for stock taking. And I'd like to remind you, as you're doing that, of what Abraham Lincoln once said. He said, if we could first determine where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. With Mr. Lincoln's admonition in mind, let's look then at where we are now, how we got there, and where you want to be in 10 years from now. As I said, I really appreciate being here because in preparing this speech, I had to do some study about you and about your organization. And I have a brand new respect for air traffic controllers. I've always felt pretty good about you when I was up there in those airplanes. But historically now, as individuals and not as machines out there, I've gained a new respect for you. I had very little idea of the difficulty, the tiring, and ultimately dangerous circumstances under which many of you worked some 10 years ago. Jack Marr tells me that in the good old days, you worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and had difficulty finding time for a restroom break on many occasions. Mike Simons is even more graphic. In describing some of those early days, he said, quote, there was a siege mentality at many of the larger and busier facilities. Go to work, hang on, hope you wouldn't get caught in a systems error, a near miss brought on by equipment, bad procedures, or sheer fatigue from long hours and heavy pressures. At that time, you were poorly organized. There were several unions and professional organizations, but very little coordination and cooperation. The working conditions described by Jack and Mike attest to the relative ineffectiveness of the then existing organizations to adequately represent controllers. And while PATCO didn't make the smoothest takeoff in labor union history, what other union do you know of that got over half its members fired or suspended in the first 2 years? Nevertheless, you're off the ground and gaining altitude and flying a lot higher than you did 10 years ago. You now have a 3-year nationwide exclusive bargaining contract covering over 14,000 controllers. That's over 85% of all the air traffic controllers in this nation. Salaries are decidedly better than they were in the past, and classifications, although still leaving much to be desired, more accurately reflect the skills required and the difficulty faced in each job. You have written, lobbied, and passed, utilizing the political process, the Air Traffic Controller's Second Career and Retirement Act. Now you can retire after 25 years of service or at age 50, and you can receive training for a second career if you become medically disqualified. Those kinds of provisions are especially important for controllers due to the demanding nature of your work. Over the years, it's been difficult to maintain the level of concentration and intensity required to do that work. Now that I'm familiar with your retirement plan, I think I'll look at it for the Congress too. I think we have about as high a burnout rate as you do. Sometimes even less structured too. In any event, you're considerably better off today than you were 10 years ago. Clearly, a substantial portion of those improvements have been achieved because you are union members and because you have a dynamic and effective union. Now, that didn't just happen. Many of you who are here today, and many who aren't, made it happen. While I spoke with tongue in cheek about losing over half your people in the first 2 years, that's not the only horror story from those early days. The original organizers of PATCO faced firings. They faced jail for leading an illegal strike. They faced foreclosure of their homes. Many survived on food stamps for months after the initial organization of this organization. Some were living day to day and city to city, I might say with U.S. Marshals in hot pursuit. All of those early leaders fought and sacrificed for the benefits you are able to enjoy today. So much for where you are and how you got there. The critical question is, where do you want to be 10 years from now, and how can you best achieve that? Just for openers, I think it's safe to assume you all want to have your full rights of citizenship, including the right to engage in political activity, both as participants and candidates. Today, you can't do that, and you won't be able to unless the Hatch Act reform legislation passes. Additionally, you'd like to have special classification and pay structures and special hours of work because of the unique nature of your job. While the U.S. has the overwhelming majority of air traffic, here controllers work 40 hours per week. In almost all other Western nations, controllers work 35 and in some instances 30 hours per week. You need more protection on your medical certification. Such protection would not be to relax standards, but to closely scrutinize actions taken. The 3 Personal Medical Review Board for Appeals that is presently guaranteed could potentially be used to penalize a controller for union activity or other matters not medically connected. In addition to matters closely affecting your working conditions, I assume you also want to see better working conditions for your fellow man, better education for your children, better medical care for yourselves and your relatives, and so on and so on. All of these things, if they are to be accomplished, will be achieved through participation in the political process. But as I noted before, you are being denied full access to the political process. For that reason, reform of the Hatch Act must be the first order of business. And since talking about reform and bringing about reform is a part of organized labor's legislative program, let me approach the Hatch Act by talking generally about organized labor and its legislative impact on the 95th Congress. I recall the euphoria with which we all greeted the news of massive Democratic victories both on Capitol Hill and in the White House in November of 1976. Now, I assume that you're not all Democrats here, and I want you to know that I'm a strong partisan Democrat. But I think whether you're Democrats or Republicans, you can and should be involved in the political process. Speaking of strong partisan Democrats, the best way to describe a strong partisan Republican is something that occurred in my own congressional district. Those of you from Seattle and the West Coast know well about the San Juan Islands. San Juan Islands are a lovely chain of islands which lay off the northwest coast of this nation. They were populated very early on by a hardy breed of people who asked no quarter and gave no quarter, all Republicans. And they hadn't been there too long when the old patriarch of the group went down to the auditor's office and walked in and said to the clerk, "Young lady, I want to change my registration from Republican to Democrat." And she looked at him and she said, "Why, sir, you've been a Republican for 90 years. I don't think I even have a Democratic registration blank here in the courthouse." But she finally made one up, and just before she gave it to him to sign, she said, "Now, are you really sure you want to do this?" And he said, "Yes, I am. I'm sure of it, ma'am." And she said, "Well, would you really mind telling me why you're doing this?" He said, "Young lady, I've just been to the doctor. He told me I've only 2 weeks to live. I figured if some of them had to go, it might as well be one of them." That's what I call a strong partisan. Indeed, with this euphoria, we felt we could pass meaningful labor legislation that had passed the Congress before, only to face certain death by veto at the hands of Richard Nixon or Gerald Ford. The difference this time was now there would be a Democrat in the White House. No longer would it be necessary to get 2/3 majority. No need to worry about vetoes. So labor prepared a veritable banquet of legislation it had been wanting for many years. It marched to Capitol Hill and asked the congressional cooks to prepare the banquet. Citus picketing was to be the soup, duck soup, or at least some thought so. Despite the fact that business and industry put on a spirited and novel campaign, labor leaders were convinced of victory with little effort. The mail on Capitol Hill was heavily one-sided. One congressman from California received 248 letters opposing Citus picketing and one in favor. I personally received computerized cards from persons that I knew to be members of unions who were opposing the measure. When the smoke cleared and the final vote was counted, Labor lost the first course by a vote of 205 to 217. Shock and dismay followed. Cries of retribution and hit list were heard. Next came the cargo preference legislation. Like Citus picketing, it had passed the 94th Congress, only to be vetoed by a Republican president. Now, not only did we have a Democratic president and a strong majority in the Congress, but even better, the present bill called for 9.5% of our oil imports to be carried in American flagships. The bill that passed Congress in 1974 had called for 30%. While a spirited campaign was waged by the maritime industry and labor, the roll call divulged another defeat for labor. The cargo preference bill was sunk by a lopsided vote of 165 to 257. Again, cries of unfair and we'll get even were heard from labor leaders and members alike. Shortly thereafter, labor was forced to settle for a lower minimum wage than it had felt was necessary. You know, at this point, it was kind of like a highly touted team that had won every preseason game and hadn't won a game since conference play had started. Finally, some sober and seasoned heads in labor sat down and tried to analyze what had happened. They drew a number of conclusions, but the major one was that the next time they had to mount a personal contact campaign. Next time was the labor law reform bill in the House. Once again, business and industry mounted a heavy campaign to defeat the bill. But this time, letters, telegrams, and telephone calls came to members from labor leaders in their districts. National labor leaders were on the phone and in members' offices explaining disputed parts of the bill. When the final tally was taken, it was clear that the tactic of personal contact had paid off. The vote was 257 to 163, almost an exact reversal of the cargo preference loss. Later House votes on Humphrey Hawkins and the Hatch Act held up and proved the earlier lessons were being profitably used. Now, it's not my desire to hold forth at length on labor in the 95th Congress. Yet, some conclusions are inescapable and also valuable if we are to achieve yet in the 95th Congress and in future Congresses those things about which I spoke earlier. First, it is now clear that many people in labor, and other places for that matter, misread the 95th Congress primarily because they misread the newer members. A majority, 37 of the freshmen, voted against situs picketing. 13 of these were Democrats who had received the Cope endorsement in the 1976 elections. Many of them are young and have not known firsthand the experiences of your founders in organizing this union. But rather than blaming them, it seems to me that labor ought to try to educate them. Presently, labor leaders share a common denominator with politicians and business executives. We're all in a dead heat for last place in the opinion polls. Undoubtedly, that has been one of the factors affecting much of labor legislation. The answer to that problem is not going to be immediate, but they include constant efforts by all of us interested in the labor movement to elect and maintain the kinds of officers who are above reproach, who are willing to work hard, and who are responsive to their membership. I suggest that you're now involved in a heated campaign. Not my desire to inject myself in that, and I will not do so. And while it is difficult for those offices that are contested and those that are close, let me say that for the vitality and vigor of this union, it is a good thing to have a spirited contest. Labor has much the same problems as the Congress, one of image. And in that matter, it's not the fact that counts, it's the perception. Some of you may have heard the way to determine fact and perception. The best way I know is to relate that story that occurred to a priest who was getting on the bus one morning to go down, John, and say Mass at 6 o'clock in the morning. He got on the bus, and there was one person sitting on the bus, a very drunk young man sitting in the front aisle reading the newspaper. The father got on the bus and thought to himself, well, now I wonder how I can help that young fellow. And so he sat down next to him, and as he was thinking, the bus pulled away, and he didn't have to because the drunk kind of shook his head, turned from his paper to the priest and said, say, Father, what really causes arthritis? And the priest, seizing this opportunity, said, young man, arthritis is caused by a life of dissipation, of drinking, gambling, chasing, staying out late, all the things this guy had obviously been involved in. Drunk just kind of shook his head, turned back to the paper and says, says here the Pope has arthritis. Well, at least the perception was something other than the fact, I think. While I don't want to be overly critical, I would be less than candid if I failed to point out in this discussion about labor and the 95th Congress that organized labor did not do its homework, particularly on the slightest picketing bill. They just assumed they were going to win and largely sat on their hands. Business and industry, on the other hand, really worked. They used the new technique of targeting computer mail. They selected 96 districts, of which 68 were represented by freshmen, and deluged the members with mail sent by their own constituents. Most of the 96 members heard very little from the other side. And the National Association of Manufacturers, Chamber of Commerce, and other business and industry lobbyists induced a lot of personal contact of members by their own constituents. They made certain their voices were heard, and that's what's needed from labor. It can work. It can work just as well on our side, as evidenced by the passage of labor law reform and the Hatch Act in the House of Representatives. Labor needs to encourage that kind of strong personal presence on important issues in the House and the Senate as well, where labor law and the Hatch Act reform are still waiting in the wings. In other words, you've got to put on the political heat. The situation that occurred, I think, with Senator Ashurst very well describes what I mean. Some of you will recall that Fountain Ashurst was the first Democratic senator, in fact, one of the first senators from the state of Arizona. And he remained in the Senate for a long time. In 1936, he sponsored President Franklin Roosevelt's court packing legislation. Most of you are too young to remember that, but at first the legislation was very popular, but it fell into disrepute, and the longer it was in the Senate, the more disrepute it fell into. And finally, Fountain Ashurst got so much problems from his own constituents that on the final day, he turned on his own legislation, spoke against it, and cast the deciding vote against the court packing legislation. As he emerged from the floor of the Senate, some enterprising young radio station reporter rushed up to him, stuck a microphone in his face and said, "Senator, in view of the fact that you originally sponsored this legislation and then turned on it, spoke against it, cast the deciding vote against it, would it be safe to say that you've seen the light?" He looked at him and he said, "Hell no, young man, I felt the heat." Well, what you've got to do is you've got to make your members feel the heat once in a while. And there's no better way to do that than with personal contact. I don't mean you get angry with them, but I mean you let them know where you stand on the issues. In response to the present situation, there's an intense self-evaluation going on inside labor today. There are some who wish to punish the defectors. Some are talking about a hit list. Presumably they would work to defeat those on the list. Others are counseling a different course. They are suggesting that labor needs to improve its methods and needs to better understand the present political environment. I would have to align myself with the latter group. I know it's much simpler to blame someone else. You simply denounce them and your work is done. But the question is, does this solve your problems? In this instance, as in most, I think not. I would opt for an affirmative approach, one that started with serious and intensive retrospection, one that asked questions like, why is union membership as a percentage of the workforce in the United States down almost 10% in the last 10 years? How is it that a union such as your own is an absolute reversal of that trend, just forming and having now 85% of all the people in its industry covered? What can be done to improve labor's overall image generally? How can labor improve, modernize, and make more effective its legislative lobbying program? There are no instant answers to all of these questions, and it would be futile to expect them. But I urge very strongly that you stay involved in the political process. I'm convinced that's the best way to achieve the goals of organized labor generally, as well as your own special goals. You're especially important, in my view, because you are a young union. You've bucked the national trend, and you've been successful. You have a lot to offer if you will stay vital and stay involved. You can help lead the way toward finding some of the answers that organized labor needs. In closing, may I suggest that as a union, you demand that Mike Rock, Dave Trick, Mike Simons, Jack Marr, Bob Poli, John Layden, and others sit down and write the history of the formation of this union. It would probably be banned in Boston, but I'm sure it would serve well. I'm sure it would serve well in informing your own members. And let's be realistic. Most of you people, this is without question the youngest, both in terms of a length of a union and in terms of the chronological age of its membership, the youngest union in the United States. Many of you out there who have not read the early history of labor and have not read a history of your own union because it doesn't exist, don't know some of the problems that these people put up with. So I think these things ought to be committed to writing and be made available to the members. And it could also serve to enlighten some of the members of Congress and other people, both in and outside of the labor movement, that not all of the horror stories and struggles in organized labor took place 100 years ago. Some of them did, of course, but many like yours are more recent, and others are continuing right today. When we accept Lincoln's suggestion to look where we are, we can see that many working people are without adequate labor representation and protection. Yet, when we examine whither we are tending, it appears that the present trend is toward less politically effective union representation of fewer workers. In judging, then, what to do and how to do it, it is clear that much of the rest of the labor movement should heed your example as a model to follow in reversing the present perilous trend. Organized labor would do well to look for inspiration to unions such as yours that still remember their past and have a clear vision of what they'd like their future to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman Meads. Before we begin, I'd like to make a brief announcement. Microphone 2 on the floor is dead at the present time. They're working on it. We hope to have it fixed before the convention's concluded. There are 5 microphones. There are 6 on the floor, 5 operating. Microphone 2 is dead. So anyone who wants to use a mic, either side, 1 or 3, be a working mic. Let's begin the business of the convention. First is the report from the Credentials Committee. The chair recognizes the chairman of the Credentials Committee for his report.
As chairman of the Credentials Committee, it is my duty and pleasure to report that there are 48 voting representatives duly registered with the committee. In addition, there are 42 alternate voting representatives duly registered with the committee. As of 9 a.m., the total number of members represented at this convention is 14,444. Of these, 6,784 are in the centers, 7,660 are in the terminals. This total reflects active voting members effective April 1st, 1978. There has been a Scribner's error in the membership breakdown by region and center area. If the voting representatives and alternates will please correct them when I read them. The cover sheet on the master should read 14,444. Page 10 of the master. In the central region, Kansas City Center, corrections, Kansas City Terminal Area, facility 332 should read 50. The total at the bottom of the page on page 10 should read 391. That is for Kansas City terminals. Page 11, at the bottom of the page, the total by the region should read terminals 666. Total region 1,343. With these changes, on behalf of the committee, I move that the roll of delegates hereby submitted be the official roll of the voting members in the convention. Thank you.
You've heard the report of the Credentials Committee. There is no second required. Any discussion on the report? Hearing none, all of those in favor of accepting the report of the Credentials Committee indicate by saying aye. Opposed? Thanks to the chair to the Credentials Committee. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Rules Committee for his report.
Rather than read through all these rules, essentially these are the same rules we used last year, except that the time limits have been reduced, and rather than Poli being identified as the representative from the national office, it could be anybody from the national office. I think we've all had the opportunity to read the rules. If there are no questions, or if there are, I would move that the rules be incorporated as is.
We've heard and seen the report from the Rules Committee. No second is required. Any discussion? Before I make the announcement on the aye votes again, I just indicate for the purposes of my brothers and sisters who are here for the first time that we'd ask that the voting reps only on the ayes and the nays, the voting reps only for those purposes so that we can have a clear delineation of the vote. We've heard the report. Those in favor of adopting the report of the Rules Committee indicate by saying aye. Those opposed? Thank you, Carl. Without objection, we'll depart from the rules which have just been adopted. And that's traditional, I guess, in PATCO, but I do think we have something important to show you this morning. For those of you that have been in the organization for a short time, or some that have been around from its inception, we do have a public perception problem that Lloyd indicated earlier that I think most of you are aware of. The sentiment of the Congress and the public on federal employees is not a very healthy one at this time. Our organization has tried to project a very positive image to the public since the inception of PATCO. We've taken the first steps, we think, in what can help counter and educate the public to the pressures and stresses of our profession. We some time back, approximately 6 months ago, contracted to do a film on the day in the life of an air traffic controller. I think after you view this film and what we intend to do with it, making it available to regional vice presidents, to facility reps, to universities, to high schools, to rotaries, it's going to have a positive impact and will create, I think, a more favorable climate, not only for the air traffic controller that's viewed in here, but because he is a federal employee, a better understanding of the public of what we do. Too often, we're the scapegoat for everything that happens in this country. We're an easy target for the president, for anyone else to direct their heat to. I think the example of 5.5 last week by President Carter, without even waiting for the Pay Council to make their recommendations, is an indication that we're the soft belly that they can touch. Without any further ado, I think that this film that you see this morning, which is not in its final version, but is open for some modification, is a step in the right direction, something we've needed for a number of years. And I'd like now for you to see the film that's been produced by PATCO, and it's called No Margin for Error, the story of the air traffic controller. While we're waiting for the film, Chairman of the Finance Committee advised me if there are any members of the committee in the audience, he'd like to meet with them immediately. Finance Committee members only. The Chairman. Do we have a union projectionist, Dave?
Would you ask any delegates, voting reps, or alternates to have it reported in?
Chairman of the Credentials Committee would like, in the interim, any voting rep or delegate who is not reported in, please to do so to the Credentials Committee while we're waiting. Okay, we're waiting for the lights.
He's going to stick out. Let these guys some cigarettes and matches.
While we're waiting.
Drop him back down. Huh? Richard.
Brian, give you one.
Yeah.
Sylvia.
Yes, sir. You have a right for the
I don't think
challenge.
we need more about 3. Excuse me, Stan. How many copies will we need of that report?
If you wanted to make the challenge, you had to make it at the time the report was read, and it was just accepted by the body. Too late.
Membership's already...
It was approved by the voting delegates just moments ago.
Michelle. You ready for your spelling test today?
Yeah.
I'm trying to get it down to 2 minutes, huh, Michelle?
Probably be a little late Friday night. I'm setting up a PATCO meeting.
Okay, that'll be fine. I don't think we have anything planned. Not that I can think of anything.
Good day in school for you. Okay, I'll see you later. Have a good day in school, Michelle. Good luck on your test. 776, there'll be a national jet off 18 departing before you land on 15.
776, I'll have him inside.
Eastern 1502, taxi in the position we hold, traffic crossing Eastern 1502, after departure, turn left northeastbound up the Anacostia River, clear for takeoff. We're going eastbound now, and we'll call you again. Taxi in the position we hold. Position hold, American Pilot.
John Thornton is a professional air traffic controller. He's working departures and arrivals from the control tower of Washington, D.C.'s National Airport.
November 776, wind 150 degrees now, and 13 gust of 18.
As the departing planes move across his radar scope, another controller in a darkened radar room below the tower is picking up the planes on his radar and will see that its way is cleared of other air traffic at National Airport. Each jet is but one of dozens of planes in National's airspace at this very moment. It's a heavy traffic day already, and there's word of severe weather in the Midwest, slowing and delaying flights to the east.
Eastern 1502, contact, time and maintain 17,000.
John Thornton, air traffic controller, monitoring the radar screen in the control tower, threading the lumbering jets through a maze of traffic, directing the blips on the screen and a series of instructions to the pilots. It's like working a giant chessboard. But there's one difference. There's absolutely no margin for error. Those blips are airplanes. Planes and people. Throughout our nationwide system, there are more than 400 control towers, as well as 26 air traffic control centers across the United States that handle the air traffic in flight, including general aviation and military flights. More than 15,000 air traffic controllers are members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, PATCO, the union that represents all of the trained, highly skilled professionals that keep air traffic flowing orderly and efficiently.
Negative refueling is my turn. 3 pounds, go ahead.
Making decisions that require split-second timing. Making sure that planes flying at hundreds of miles per hour are properly separated and spaced to ensure safety and avoid accidents.
4 Tango Victor, Roger, James Crew.
The other end of the controller's headset, the pilot, relying on the controller to get him to his destination safely.
Reported over Denver by an American 707, flight level 370. Roger, Denver, United 52. Would 41,000 feet be available?
United 52, contact Denver Center.
The pilot takes his instructions from the controller. High-speed instructions to high-speed planes swarming the airways. Rising, descending, in holding patterns, always on the move, closely watched, closely monitored to safe landings.
Traffic, 2 o'clock, 4 miles, northwestbound.
Aircraft that Controller John Thornton has directed from National have been picked up by controllers manning radar at the Washington Air Route.
I would not make any plans for Wednesday night. We intend to go all day Wednesday, a short break Wednesday evening, and then a night session to take care of all the resolutions. So those people that are here as delegates and voting reps and workers, I would not make any early dinner plans, and I would not make any show plans. Maybe a late show at midnight. We might be able to get out of here by midnight, but we're going to run it right up into the night in an attempt to get rid of all the resolutions except for the new business resolutions, and then that'll be on Thursday morning. All right, I'll start reading the messages. Every table should have a PATCO message pad. If you want a message read from the podium, you must put the message on one of these pads, and we will read them whenever we have the convenience to cut them off. All right, Houston. I took care of that with the ladies, with the film. We took care of that, baby, for you people. 1 o'clock, we are going to reconvene, and it'll be 1 o'clock sharp, please. We will start the nominations and the acceptance of the speeches. Anybody not having a ticket for the luncheon that would like to go to the luncheon, you must buy your ticket before 1 o'clock today so that we can give the hotel an accurate count of how many lunches. It must be done by 1 o'clock. And I also suggest anybody that does not have tickets for the banquet and the dance, get them as soon as possible. We have to give the hotel a count. We're accountable for that count, and we must pay it whether you show or not. We will not be selling tickets at the door, so you must get those tickets prior to the functions. There is a meeting of the editors that would like to attend of the local newsletters. We will have our national lady that runs our newsletter. It's at 9:30 to 11:30 in the Pacific Region Caucus room. And they forgot to tell me what day that is, because it's past 9:30. What day is that, Lee? That is tomorrow. All right, the Great Lakes will caucus immediately after this general session in the Great Lakes Regional room. Dr. Siegel, the Southern Region, will caucus immediately when we break here. Are the other regions caucusing on the break? Okay, the Southern Region, amend that. Their caucus will take place after the break this afternoon. Same thing with the Western Region. Caucus immediately following the break this afternoon. Southwest Region has indicated they will caucus the same time immediately after the break. And Max Winter from the Central says the same thing, I assume. We miss any regions? All right, we'll stand adjourned at 1 o'clock sharp, please.